Sometimes finding what you lost leads you to the last place you would think to look.
Well, hey there, Indy, turn your dial. Dapper Don's here to make you smile with a co-host sharp and riff so true. We've got the last, the rants, the view. What's going on? Oh, what's the word? Indy's the city where we'll be heard. From Monument Circle to Broad Ripple on. What's going on with Dapper Don? So grab your coffee, Hoosiers. Let's get to it, 'cause we're in the house!
What's going on? It's Dapper Don, and I'm excited to welcome you all back. Tonight, we're not just talking about finding yourself. We already did that. We're not talking about what to do with that new identity. We did that too. Tonight, we're going to get down and dirty and look at the flip side of that coin. What happens when you don't? Our guest for the evening, Dr. Josh Caraballo, author of award-winning memoir I'm Not Dead Yet, went from a stifled identity to addiction, prison, and a very unfortunate stage 4 cancer diagnosis to reconstructing his entire life from the ground up. Now he's a renowned industrial organizational psychologist, making sure that no one, at least in the workplace, has to stuff who they are into a box, doing for them what he would have wanted done for him. I'm glad to have you, Josh.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Happy to be here.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, you've said before that a lot of your choices in your early life weren't really yours. When did you first realize that your life was being lived for you?
What a wonderful question. I believe it was right before I turned 18 in high school, probably around 16 or 17, where I was able for the first time in my life, because middle school was really tough, where I didn't know what type of identity or where I belonged or how I could forge one so that I could make friends. I wasn't allowed to make friends outside of the Jehovah's Witness religion that I was brought up in. So there's a lot of parameters, a lot of rules. And high school obviously gets you closer to that quote unquote adult marker of 18, although we also understand that after we reach the age of 18 and beyond that it's pretty arbitrary, that number. I'm still growing up today. But anyway, in high school, I started to gain friends and started to forge a personality through humor and through art and through storytelling. And that became really powerful in ways that it was bringing me happiness and connections that I was not receiving before that. Once I started to see that there were glimmers of hope outside of the Jehovah's Witness religion and the confines of the parameters, if you will, of what I grew up in, I realized that there was more to explore, and I was very excited to keep exploring and learning more. So one of the first things I set as a goal was to go to college and do it somewhere outside of the family unit, particularly to go back to New York City where I grew up, because the family had moved to South Florida at that time, so that I could just, see what else was out there. But yeah, that's when I started to realize that a lot of the decisions I had made in my life were made on behalf of me and not necessarily for my well-being.
And did that feel normal at the time, or was there always a voice in your head sort of going, this ain't you?
It's funny because what is normal, right?
Right.
I prefer the word typical. Like nothing in my life ever seemed typical. Just imagine always feeling like the kid that was different or one-off or separate. Even in my earliest memories, like kindergarten, when I would sit there and the entire class would be drawing pictures of what Christmas meant to them, I was not allowed to participate. So I would sit there and either do nothing or I would get a different activity. But most of the time it would be just me being excluded. And as a consequence of that, is just imagine if that's happening in the very early days of your life, when your brain is first forming its original connections. Well, on the one hand, I don't want to sound like this is a pity party for me where, oh, poor Josh, the way he grew up
Right.
just seems so horrible. There are bright sides. There are positive aspects to that because at this day and age, when I sit in meetings for work, as an example, I tend to think differently. And that can actually be a good asset. So it was hard for me to belong. Obviously, it was hard for me to understand where to fit in. It did not feel typical or normal, if you will, from my earliest memories. But I began to see that as an asset and a strength as I continued to navigate through the world. And it wasn't in that moment. In fact, a lot of times in that moment, we don't see much of anything at all. But in hindsight, you get to see a lot of different things and you could change your perspective and your framing on the things that have happened to you that have caused you pain, strife, etc. And that doesn't remove the pain, the strife, the trauma that was created. What it does is help you to process that, be able to clear the way so that you can find ways of flourishing that is going to look different than what you were told it needs to look like and the expectations that were sprung upon you from a child. And that's not only through religion, obviously, that can happen through society as well, as we all know.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think something interesting that you did say was the fact that you didn't have it like you weren't necessarily dealing with a toxic situation because a lot of the stories, similar to yours where people are coming out and they are growing into themselves is usually, I grew away from these people were completely toxic, but your story seems to have a bit more nuance than that. And I mean, I know that there were still some things that you were obviously afraid to express about yourself, but I just want to know kind of why tell the story with such nuance?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. I don't want to detract or take away from people who have come from beginnings or circumstances that were truly toxic. And as
Mhm.
you have alluded to, there were elements of my childhood that were toxic in nature. But I believe a lot of these sorts of circumstances, from my perspective anyway, again, not to take away from other people's stories, do have a lot of nuance embedded. And the reason why I say that is because human beings and their interactions with each other have a lot of nuance. It is much easier to cast a shadow or use a binary to talk about a situation. It simplifies it. It helps us to understand who we want to cast as the winners and losers, if you will, the good people, the bad people. But as I've gotten older in life, I've noticed and understood that it is very rare to come across someone who is truly 100% evil or truly 100% an angel, if you will. There's so much nuance to that. We'll have those darker sides to us. We don't always act on them. Some of that is a lot more minute than other things. There are very drastic and very bad, evil things that people can do. And with the advent of technology, it can seem like those types of things are increasing. But I'm along the lines of really trying to understand human behavior, obviously from a psychologist's viewpoint, but more than that, also through an artist's viewpoint. And I find that I'll take my parents as an example. They made a decision to bring me up as a Jehovah's Witness that caused
Mhm.
me a lot of internal strife for obvious reasons. But by separating myself from those emotions once I was able to, I couldn't do it while I was processing. I was very upset at the time when I was kind of figuring out what it was about my past that was really triggering me in a lot of situations that was holding me back from really flourishing. So there was a lot of anger involved during that time, which makes sense, a lot of disappointment. But once you come to terms with that, you can actually start to put yourself in these people's shoes. In this case, it was my parents and other people that I grew up with as well, who were mentors for me, who were teaching me supposedly what was right and wrong in life, and that being who I was actually an abomination, and then having to undo that. Those are all really adult things. You can't expect
Right.
a kid to do. So, once you're able to, I understood that my parents were acting out of love, not out of hate or
Hmm.
resentment towards me, and that they truly thought that that route would be the best thing. One analogy I like to use just very quickly is it is so possible for someone in their life, whether it be your parents, your best friends, or otherwise, to find the very thing that creates an effect like a potion. So they find this potion, they drink it, and it does wonders for their life. Obviously, it's an allegory, there is no potion out there. But that very same potion, if you will, that someone drinks and creates all these wonderful effects can have the opposite effect for someone else, can actually be a poison for them. And so I think the challenge for us in these cases is to hold both truths simultaneously and say, it is actually possible for this to produce both effects. It's the same substance, but it doesn't have the same type of positive effect. In some cases, it can have a really negative, deleterious effect for people. Acknowledging that is so important because when we don't, I think that's where a lot of the vitriol starts to develop with people. My religion is better than yours. My way of working out is better than yours. I mean, you could use it, you could apply that to anything. My way of being a queer person in the world or being an advocate for X is better than yours. It is an easy trap to get ourselves involved in because it feels good and we get a high off of feeling superior to other people. But it's definitely a trap. And so,
Yes.
humility, when we have the golden potion that we have found for ourselves, I think adding humility to that is very important. And also understanding that it's not going to work for everyone else because we're all different people. It might work for a wide swath of people, but that still is not everyone. Keeping that in mind, I think, is really important. Those are the takeaways that I've found throughout my life that are really important. Those nuances would not exist if I wasn't willing and able to take the journey to see what was it about my childhood that was actually good for me.
Right. Right. And what's interesting about what you just said there, too, was the fact that, when your parents were raising you, they were giving you everything that they could give you. And I think a lot of people kind of ignore that aspect of it. Now, obviously, if you're the victim of abuse and you're the victim of, a toxic household, I'm not expecting you to view that in a nuanced light. I'm expecting you to get away from that as fast as possible. But in cases like yours or even mine, where our parents weren't necessarily the best, but they weren't necessarily the worst, you got to kind of view it as, well, this was an improvement on their childhood. This was an improvement on their childhood where they would have to go out and get a switch and be beat to death with it. And then if it wasn't big enough, they'd be beat again, that sort of thing. So I think it's very interesting that you brought that up.
Right. I think context is everything, and you're absolutely right. There are situations when people are being abused. It's not time for nuance. It's time to figure out a solution for that child or for that family or for whoever is the victim of that abuse. In addition to anything else that falls in line in that same category, which is why I'm very careful with saying, I feel very blessed and lucky, fortunate, if you will, to have lived in a family where I do believe that my parents did the best job that they possibly could. And I was brought up with love. And a lot of that love was actually shown to me when I started to have a lot of issues with substance abuse,
Hmm.
where even through everything, even though my parents knew that I had come out as gay, that they still found a place to support me and to say that they still loved me and that they wanted me to live and that they could see that I was destroying my life.
Exactly. And I want to dive a little bit more into actually your experience navigating the Jehovah's Witnesses religion and the family dynamics following that. How were you able to navigate a religion like the Jehovah's Witnesses? Because I'm assuming it had to be really hard following something that kind of went against who you were.
Right. Well, to be very honest, when I first started learning about the teachings and how it went completely against who I was, I thought I could change. Not everyone has this reaction, but I did. I thought, well, then the onus is on me. God
Hmm.
must know what he's talking about. And everything that was said through the religion came from God, and I truly believe that. I mean, in hindsight, it's really human beings that are determining what is right and what is wrong based on Bible verse, and we could argue back and forth about that sort of thing. Not you and I, but the royal you
Right,
could
right.
argue. Some people love to use Bible verses as, I'd say, weapons, and there's plenty of other podcasts and people out there who have taken the time, I think, very astutely to pick apart those arguments and just show how illogical they are. So for me, it was all very logical because that's all I knew, which again is a huge learning lesson in life. When we look at people who maybe are on the opposite side of the world, and we see how they live or believe, and we think to ourselves, how could anyone ever believe or live or react that way? Just keep in mind it happens all the time. People here in America, people get put into silos to where their whole worldview is just exactly what is bounced around through their ecosystem. It would be social media, their friends, except once that happens, it is a form of brainwashing. So it makes sense that I thought that this was all very real to me. And so then I must do everything in my power to change that. As you might imagine, for someone who is truly gay and not just questioning or maybe just dabbling in some type of sexual behaviors, also understanding that this is not just about sex, it is about who you are fundamentally as a person. So there's things that you need to work out and it's okay to question that. But once you realize that this is who you are and you try to hide or suppress that, goes back to psychology. It's not going
Right.
away. And a lot of
No.
times it's going to come back with a vengeance. And that was exactly what happened to me. I can
Hmm.
suppress as much as I want, but it will keep coming out in ways that I can't even fathom. And people are going to pick up on that. They're going to pick up on my inauthentic nature. I'm not going to be able to navigate through the world, and doors are not going to open. People are not going to align with me because they're going to feel that I am not bringing my true self. And if that is happening in a place where I cannot bring my true self because the repercussions of that is to be denied access to that. So you get disfellowshipped, is what they call it, which means you are kicked out of the religion. If that is everything that you know, then there isn't much choice for you but to hold on and try your very best to be the person that
Yeah.
you think everyone else needs you to be. This can exist
Right.
in any organization, in any structure. It exists a lot of times at work. We feel that we must perform a certain way that goes against our very nature and sometimes our values in order to make it or in order to get to the next role. I heavily discourage that because I don't believe that that is actually true. I think we've created these structures to where we play the game as if that is exactly what needs to get done. But in reality, there are plenty of examples of people who have maintained their authenticity. And what I mean by that is being true to yourself. You can still be professional and be true to yourself. Being true to your identity in all aspects, especially the parts of your identity that are important for you to flourish, and being true to the ideals and values that you hold near and dear to your heart, because there is no value that is negative. That's not a value. So if you're true to those things in navigating through the world and forging circumstances and not allowing people, places, and things to enter your life when given the opportunity, when you have a say, you're going to have more instances of really flourishing instead of feeling like your entire life or the majority of it is you having to play this exhausting game of playing a role.
Yep, yep. So, just to clarify, just to make sure I understand you right, you can't pray the gay away?
Well, you know, I'd say more than likely not,
Damn
but
it.
I think anything is possible. I think if someone is what I mean by that is, what is praying? Praying is faith. And if someone truly has faith that by prayer they're going to remove the gay that exists or the queerness that exists within them, it's one thing to feel like you're forced to do it because you're playing the game. It's another thing, it's slightly different, I believe, when you actually believe it yourself. And I've come from both of those.
Mhm.
So what I'm trying to get at here is I don't actually think that praying would take it away, but if you truly believe that, there could be an opportunity where you're actually experimenting with that for yourself to see if that's going to work for you. And if it does, well, then great. But for most people, I'd say the vast majority of people, it's not going to. So, I had to try to not be gay. I had to date women in high school because I needed to know for myself that I truly could not change. As I was embarking on that, if someone were to laugh or to say, "How dare you?" or "You're wasting your time," I would have told them off. I would have been like, "No, I truly want this right now. I need this for my future." There's a whole laundry list that I had convinced myself about, including God, but even much more than that.
Right, right.
Now looking
And
back, I needed to go through that in order to get to the place to where so that's what I mean when I say, well,
right.
maybe for some people you need to go ahead and try to pray the gay away. And I think people should be given that space, not forced. That's different. Not told that they must do that. But there are a subset of people, including myself, who truly do believe that this is not right, this is wrong, that now, but I'm just saying, like, I think there needs to be space for people to learn on their own, hopefully in a safe space, although that doesn't always happen either, but it's tricky, and that's where the nuance exists.
Well, I'll say this. For one, this is a sentiment that's actually been on the show before, and that's that departure from yourself in order to find yourself again, and that actually being what builds a stronger sensation of self.
Hmm.
The second thing I have to bring up is the fact that here is a gay man who has pulled more women than some straight men. So, yeah, you guys are failing. But, anyways, religion at times does a lot of fire and brimstone talk, and I think we've kind of dived into it a little bit. I mean, hell, a lot of the stuff in the Bible comes down to tribalism and war and all that stuff. But with the constant feeling that your world was going to end just kind of looming over you, did you ever feel like it was pointless to keep going? And how did you pull yourself out of that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think once I left the coop, so to speak, at the age of 18, it wasn't too much longer that I was diagnosed with cancer. So I think that's an important aspect of the story here because what do you think I did as soon as I left and I was at the age of 18? I did everything that I was not supposed to do in terms of, being a gay man, being in New York City, and having the confines of all those rules that I had to follow. I was free as a bird. And then about 6 months into that, I was diagnosed with cancer. My logical brain at that point in time said, "This is God. God has now told me exactly what's up. He's shown me that everything I was taught is exactly right. That by engaging in the behaviors I was told not to, there's going to be grave repercussions." And here they are. So even after my stint with cancer and it came back a second time and I finally got into remission. So fast forwarding about 5 years after that, I now had the opportunity to go back to who I was, myself, right? Because I was too embedded in being sick to even start thinking about any of that. I wasn't thinking about my sexuality or anything. I was thinking about surviving, Once that was done, I had to go back to who I was, and I wasn't ready for that. I wasn't set up for that, and I didn't wanna live because, to your point, what was the point of living? What was the point of thriving if I'm just going to be destroyed anyway? I couldn't articulate it the way I am right now, but my behaviors definitely showed that because as soon as I was cleared with a diagnosis of being in remission, I went right into drinking heavily and dabbling in drugs. That was the beginning of my downfall in terms of destroying myself. At the time, I did not make the connection as to why I was doing it, but in hindsight and with the help of psychology, I was able to make those connections and understand just why I hated myself so much. I had internalized the homophobia, the vitriol, the hate, and I started to allow that to become who I was.
Right, right. And now, kind of looking back, what do you think that your cancer was trying to send a message to you? Or do you just kind of think that it was a natural process that your body ended up unfortunately going through and it could have happened to anybody at any time?
Definitely the latter. I mean, that's a good question to follow up with. I definitely do not believe that God gives anyone cancer, but I do believe, although this is not scientific or based in psychology, this is just Josh speaking now. I believe that the universe gives us things to learn from, to grow from, especially if we survive those things, and maybe even to help others. And so that belief, because I still believe in God. We could talk more about that if you like. I just
Mhm.
don't believe it's the God that I was trained to understand. And so I renegotiated what God looks like to me. I renegotiated what it means to be on this earth and to navigate through this universe, if you will. And maybe it's an excuse, but in my mind, receiving cancer, although as horrific as it was, had a purpose. I don't think it was God, though, giving it to me, to be very clear, but I still think there was a purpose behind it.
Right. Because I mean, I do agree that the universe does kind of give us things and I also have a strong belief in God. But I kind of take the God is love thing to its logical end point, I guess you would say, to the point where like if God is love, then any instance of vitriol, hatred, oppression, anything like that against any group of people would not be something that's a part of his rule book.
Mm,
After all, a mother's love is supposed to not even equal a fraction of what God's love is. And mind you, our mothers love us so much that they're willing to jump in front of moving buildings and or moving cars and like, leap buildings to pull us out of danger?
yeah. Yeah. I love this because it's also one of the talking points that I'll see for people who talk about the Bible or who have been born again from religion, if you will.
Mhm.
Absolutely. We learn that it is in the Bible that God is love and also that we are made in God's image. So it makes sense that when we try to practice love that it doesn't always get to the type of love or the amount of love that we would perhaps like. We fail, we falter, we are imperfect with our love, and so we try and try again. But if this is a form of perfect love, as it should be and as it's taught to people, then, there is no room for any of those things that you list. Absolutely.
And I guess the before we go on break, the last question that I'm gonna kind of go into here is, well, I don't know kind of how quite to put this, so I'm just gonna say it. What caused you to finally just stop thinking that you were unholy, or do you still struggle with those thoughts?
Yeah, that's a really great question. When something this is another thing that I learned through psychology and child psychology. When something happens in your childhood, when you're initially making those connections in your formative years, it's not that it can't go away, but can sometimes stay with you for a very long time. I'll just put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not that it haunts me. It's not that those things or those voices are there every day. But just like with anything else that creates trauma, there are trigger points or activation points that exist in one's life. For me, it happens anytime that I feel rejected. I start to think that I'm just not worthy or good enough. But acknowledging that and understanding and knowing what those trigger points or activation points are, I think are really important so that we understand why we are feeling a certain way. And then we have tools at our disposal that can assist with getting our mindset out of that. Again, not by denying it or deflecting, but taking it on, absorbing it, like I said, acknowledging it. And it gets easier over time. This is not something when you're very close to the traumatic event itself that I would advocate for. I think having a helping professional like a therapist would be very important to gain some or a lot of those tools. Also, reading, listening to other people's stories, figuring out what's going to work best for you as a person or someone else in your life that you know might need that assistance. But it's not going to be the same for everyone, which goes back to one of my earlier points, that it's really about the experimentation that needs to happen so that you can fall in love with yourself while learning more about how you tick and why you do the things that you do and why you react the way that you do to the world. I just turned 49, so I will be learning and growing and understanding myself for the rest of my life. And that's okay. You never get there. It's not a destination.
Oh wow, 49. That means that there are things that you have been doing for longer than I've been alive. Oh gosh.
Well, yeah, that makes me feel a little older now.
But yeah, that was some heavy stuff so far. So I thank you for being so open with us, Doc. But
Sure.
with all that being said, I think it's only right that we decompress a little with a groove break before we dive deeper into the good doctor's story. This discussion is going to get more intense from here, and I don't think you want to miss 1 second of it. You're watching What's Going On with Dapper Don. Stay tuned.
It's high time for you to die. Your existence is a crime. You're a problem I must solve, so I can save them all. For him I will claim your soul, then your kind will pay the toll. That's my duty as a hero, to make my people whole. She fights so we see the sun, our hearts beating as one. She'll quickly end your run because her spear is just. I'm the hope of monster kind, and I'd like to tell you why. But why would I enlighten you when you're about to die? Now you will never know this underground is not our home. We'll climb out of this crappy hole and reclaim your world. I'm determined to your end. I fight for the freedom of all my friends. You will pay for what happened then. You run away, but I will chase you. Can't comprehend the tears of a king who lost it all, the fears of a queen watching her kingdom fall, the desperate screams, the emphatic calls for retribution, revolution, or humanity's fall. She fights so we see the sun, our hearts beating as one. She'll quickly end your run because her spear is just. I'm the hope of monster kind, and I'd like to tell you why. But why would I enlighten you when you're I defeat you, we will rise again. That's why you and I will never be friends. Your falling down here was your greatest mistake, but I'm glad you did with what's at stake. I'm the hope of monster kind, and I'd like to tell you why, but why would I enlighten you when you're about to die? No, you will never know this underground is not our home. We'll climb out of this crappy hole and reclaim yours. I'm the hope of monster kind, and I'd like to tell you why, but why would I enlighten you when you're about to die? No, you will never know this underground is not our home. We'll climb out of this crappy hole and reclaim your
You're tuned in to What's Going On with Dapper Don. Don't touch that dial. And we're back. For those of you just tuning in, we just got through talking about Dr. Josh's early life and everything he went through that kept him from embracing who he truly was. Now we're going to get into the consequences of that suppression. Now, you've mentioned that there was kind of a spiral in your life that kind of started with you having lascivious encounters with older men. What kind of got you thinking that it was love?
Well, it wasn't just older men. It was just men in general.
Okay.
Yeah. But the encounters, I think, were multifaceted. There's this wonderful, I say wonderful, but I say that because it was so eye-opening for me, understanding in psychology and research and psychosocial research specifically, which states that very rarely can you attribute one causal variable to a human phenomenon. So I love that because, again, human beings, for simplicity's sake, will a lot of times fall into it was that person's fault. It was this thing that happened to me that created this. And by keeping this principle in mind, it's very helpful to understand and know that doing anything related to behaviors, especially in my life, that I found myself in, such as having sex with multiple partners at different age groups. Was it because I was looking for love? I'd say the answer is yes. Was it because I wanted to experience sex with different people? I'd say yes. Was it because of all the suppression that I did in my life? Yeah, I can go on.
Right.
Now, what was the most important thing for me? I'm not sure. Was love driving that for me? I mean, I could argue that I was getting love from my household, from my parental unit, but was that enough for me? Did I feel validated? Did I feel like I belonged? Did I feel like my whole entire self was being accepted?
Right. Right.
Well, I
And
can't say for sure that just by
yeah.
having sex with someone that that's the case, but
Mm-hmm.
it was a start. It was more than what I was perhaps getting elsewhere. So,
Yeah. And I think the thing that people misunderstand about sex is, casual sex is something that has been in our society for a long time. And, there are people who can genuinely have sex with somebody and feel nothing. But the amount of oneness that you come into when you are engaged in that can be a little bit, it can be intense. And, again, there are people who can go do that and feel nothing, but you can't judge somebody who goes into that thinking that that might be love or thinking that, because hell, for all we know, that could be the very basis of it. You know what I'm saying?
right, exactly. With my particular story here, I think it's important to understand that my understanding of sex, especially with the same sex, was something that should never be done in my life. In addition to that, I was sexually abused by a female in the family who was not an immediate family member, but an extended family member. And it happened for a few years. And what is probably the most important thing about that, and this is when I was very, very young, probably about 6 or 7 years old, I was told repeatedly from this person that the reason why this was happening and that she was engaging in this was because she loved me. So you hit on something really important here, at least for my story, and everyone's is going to be different. And why does someone seek out sex for love, as an example? In my particular case, it's because I was taught at a very young age that those two things, sex and love, were one and the same. I had no reason not to believe my cousin, who was much older than me, that she was trying to show me love by engaging in sex. I know better otherwise now, obviously, but what that does to the human psyche as a child and as you grow up and then you're able to start formulating relationships because you're pretty much um away from the world. In fact, there's a word for it. They say worldly people, you're not allowed to really socialize with them. So, I wasn't having sexual relations. Well, I actually was sneaking out of my house at the age of 17. Sorry, mom and dad, when you hear this, but um, the point,
Gotcha.
the point is like, you know, once I started doing that, it was very difficult for me to separate between love and sex. Like they were one and the same. And as I got older and had therapy, and again, this is one of those things that can still creep up in different ways, I had to try to undo as much as that as possible to understand the distinctions, to understand, to your point, that you can have sex and it can mean absolutely nothing in terms of relationships or love, that this could be just something that happens for one night. But it was very difficult for me to make those distinctions early on.
Right. And I just I wanted to bring that up because I know that, I mean, we've made jokes on this show. You know, the word slut's been thrown around on this program I don't know how many times. And I mean, it's just like there are jokes, so many jokes aimed at people, who have been, but as someone who's also been in a situation of mistaking sexual intercourse and sexual feelings for love, I just don't genuinely have any judgment in my heart for people who go through that, and it's more people than you would think.
Hmm.
If you really sat down and asked somebody who had a lot of partners why they did it or why, what was going on, you'd be surprised at what they told you.
Yeah.
And it's like, again, we can make all the jokes we want, but at the end of the day, these are still people that have feelings and emotional needs that still need to be met.
I think there's always room for judgment, right? Because it is a
Mhm.
human thing. There are mainstays or universal truths about judgments in the sexual sphere of conversation that should remain judgmental, such as what happened to me as a youth, right?
Mhm.
But when it comes to the nuance, as we've been talking about a lot, like in this conversation thus far, I think that's where a lot of the conversations can really use why is there judgment here? Does there need to be judgment here? Where does the judgment come from? And it's not only in the sexual conversations, obviously. I go all the way back to my childhood when I was sitting there not able to participate. There was judgment on myself. There was judgment on me from the teachers. Like, "Oh, I'm not going to give you another activity. This is what the class is doing." There's so many instances where I've been hyper aware of judgments outside of, like I said, the universal truths that should always be judged. But putting those aside, when you look at the nuances that exist in life, how many times do we end up judging other people, and what good is that doing for ourselves and for them? Because those are usually the places where we learn the most. Those are usually the
Yes.
places where other people can flourish. If we just allow ourselves to lift that judgment and stop that from halting people, because we just may not understand it. We may not do it ourselves. We may not think that that's the best route to go. But this is what makes humanity and the human experience so exciting and amazing, I think.
Right. Right. And I think that's a wonderful point. And I do kind of want to actually get a little bit more insight into your experience. So I want to talk about, and you can be as vague or as specific as you want. What caused you to go to prison?
Yeah. So back to after my cancer diagnosis and being diagnosed as in remission, which for my particular case took 5 years after my last treatment of radiation and chemotherapy after it had come back a second time. I wasn't in a place to really treat myself well. So I started to abuse drugs and alcohol for about 8 years. And as you can imagine, as the years progressed, so did my disease, to the point where I became more and more belligerent, didn't care about life or other people. And I actually had 3 DUIs in my lifetime during that span of time. I think it was more like 10 years, so 8 to 10 years. And the final DUI resulted in me going to prison. Was not listening. I was not trying to get better. And that was thrust or forced upon me. So you want to talk about how in my early days, there was sort of the structure imposed upon me that gave me the rules of how to live my life in many different ways. And then I found a way to get away from that structure because it just wasn't the right structure for me in order to flourish. Years later, finding myself in a different type of structure with no say in whether or not I could or wanted to be in that. But also, that's what I needed. I needed to get clean. I needed to get sober. I needed to contemplate my life and say, is this what I wanted to keep pursuing and doing? Destroying myself and perhaps destroying other people while that was happening, and probably going to end up dead if I were to continue that trajectory. It was really important. In this case, the structure was needed, although the structure in this case is highly punitive.
Hmm.
It's what shook me up in order to change my life.
Right. And it's very interesting that because a lot of people, they go to prison and then they come out and then they're not as at least they don't allow themselves to be as functional when they come back out. But one thing I kind of want to ask you is because people really underestimate this. They talk to somebody who's been in prison for 20 years, and they'll talk about their experience, but they'll talk about it they won't talk about it in terms of emotion. I want to know, what was your initial feeling when you first walked in those doors?
It was close to probably the second most fearful, completely traumatic experience that I've ever had, second to having cancer. The difference is I really didn't do anything to put myself in to get cancer. I thought I did, but
Mm-hmm.
the reality is I didn't. I actually put myself in a situation or situations to land myself into prison. So that's a major difference. And at the end of the day, when I felt like all was lost for cancer, it was really out of my hands as to what I could do. There are doctors, there are treatments, but there was no guarantees. So I was at the beck and call of that system, the medical system. In this particular case, I did have an option, although it wasn't immediately available to me, but I had plenty of time. I was sentenced to 18 months and I
Mm-hmm.
got out in 14 months for good behavior. So it was still over a year that I had to really truly contemplate my life, my decisions, and what it was that I wanted to do. Thankfully, this goes back to my upbringing. It was instilled in me at a very young age, as well as all the principles and rules and guidelines from being a Jehovah's Witness, but also that I was a good person and that my heart was in a place to where I knew that my role here on this earth, whether it be from the universe or otherwise, was not to destroy myself and just go away. The very earliest memories that I had of my childhood was of me performing plays. They were Bible stories for my parents, and I found a lot of joy in that. And
Mm-hmm.
also, some of my earliest memories were of me just going to random strangers and hugging them. And I remember I would hug their legs because I was such a small person compared to them, and how upset my mom would be because I would just be running over to strangers and hugging them. And not everybody has the best interests of a child in mind. So what I'm getting at is when I was in prison, I started to go back to the core of who I am because that doesn't go away. No matter what happens in your life, no matter how many bad things you end up doing, this is that nuance that I talk about. It's not black and white. It's not this or that. It's not a binary. I engaged in a lot of bad behaviors that were not good for me, but I knew at the very core of who I was not a bad person. And returning to that was extremely important because once I realized that was my truth, then all I needed to do after that, and it's not all, I don't want to make it sound too simplistic. It was a lot of work for me, but I had to make a conviction to myself that I was not going to allow myself to go back there anymore. That I was going to do everything in my power, whatever it took, to go back to that core and live a better life.
Right. You could say so. Prison was like an exfoliating pad for you. Essentially, you had accumulated all this dirt and grime, and it was to the point where something kind of rough needed to happen to kind of knock all that off.
Yeah, and that's what it was needed for me. I mean, I hit rock bottom a few times. Obviously, if I was getting DUIs, there was a lot of other things that were happening You just don't go out and drive a car for the first time and then get a DUI. It's usually something that
Right.
happens repeatedly. And for me to have three of them, for sure that I just was not learning my lesson. So hitting rock bottom in real life, if you will, was not shaking me up enough to want to change. And so I needed something even more extreme than hitting rock bottom, which was prison. I still wouldn't advocate prison for everyone. I think it is a horrible place to be.
Yeah, so don't go to prison if you really just really need a rough intervention. You can talk to your local crackhead, but don't go to prison.
Yeah, and I think you're hitting on something. This is also in the psychology. There are people out there that can learn from the vicarious nature that exists by listening to other people's stories.
Mm-hmm.
Some people have to learn it for themselves. I happen to be one of those people. Like, I question a lot. Like I had said before, I learned from a very young age that being different and thinking differently is sometimes detrimental to connections and making friends, but also can be a great asset. And I carry that with me. No, this is not a good thing. I question that, and sometimes I need to figure it out for myself. I've gotten better with that over time because obviously I've put myself in a lot of bad situations. But my point is, like, by knowing yourself, you know that by listening to someone else's story, that might be a good way for you to learn vicariously, or maybe not. Maybe it's something that you need to kind of like question and investigate further. My point here is just be careful if you are the investigative side of that, because you want to try to learn as much as possible from stories like this, because I wish I didn't need to go through a prison stint in order to get where I am. It just happens to be my story, and so maybe that's part of the reason why I'm here telling it, to help other people avoid that extreme situation.
And I can only hope that if you're listening to this episode, you don't go anywhere near a jailhouse. I mean, you can just pick a person off the street and do that. I promise you, it'll be much better off. But I now want to transition into your, just a couple more questions in regards, a couple final questions in regards to your self discovery journey. One, what part of you during this did you find was getting stronger that you didn't even know existed? Like, think about your entire life. What part of you grew that you didn't even know existed?
Resilience. I don't know how much longer I'm going to live. This is why I titled my memoir, I'm Not Dead Yet.
I'm not dead yet.
But I've lived this long on this earth. I just turned 49, as I mentioned, and that resilience, I mean, I don't know many people. I haven't come across anyone who has survived cancer twice, who has gone to prison, who has gone from abusing drugs and alcohol to a life of sobriety, who has come from a Jehovah's Witness background or something similar and has been able to find a way to flourish. That doesn't make me some superhuman person. That doesn't make me any better than any other typical human being on this earth. What it does mean is that I've been tested in ways that most people have not been tested. And for whatever reasons, I'm still here. So
Yes.
I keep going back to, there's got to be a reason for that. I think that reason is to do exactly what we're doing now, to talk about it, to share that, to give people hope, to allow people to understand that no matter how dark or deep it gets for you, that it doesn't have to stay that way. It's fine to hear that from people and from therapists. It's another thing to actually know that the stories exist that are concrete.
Yes.
And then we can pick and choose the things, the stories, the elements that align with us as learning principles so that we can incorporate that into our life and not just build hope, but look forward to so many things that can help us grow as human beings. I think that's why I've had to go through that.
Yep. Yep. And that's a great final thought right there. My final thought is this. Do you have any idea how hard this thumbnail is going to be to make? Oh my God. We go from, let's see. So we start with, your kid in school, you grow up, you're gay. Then you go, then unfortunately, you get cancer. Okay. We're still within some, but then you go to prison. And then you're a Jehovah's Witness. What the fuck? There's no color scheme. I can't, this is not, see, but anywho, I really thank you for coming onto the show. I appreciated your insight into things, and you've helped me learn a lot, and I think you've helped my listeners learn a lot as well.
Well,
So where can they actually get your memoir?
yeah, sure. So my website is drjosh.solutions. That's in place of a .com or .org. So if you're waiting for more of the URL, it's not coming. That's it. drjosh.solutions. That's with an S at the end, spelled DRJOSH, and solutions just like the word. My memoir, where you can purchase it, is on there. It's on multiple online stores. You can get a physical book. You can get an ebook. You can get an audiobook if you prefer. You can also reach out to me. You can see some of the other things that are going on. I haven't updated it in a little bit. I'll tell on myself. I'll need to go in there and just kind of add some things. So if you see that the information is like 6 months to a year old, I apologize, but it's been busy. It's been a busy start of the year. Yeah, but
Somebody needs a web developer.
exactly. Yeah. So if you're out there and you want to reach out, yeah. So that's the best way to contact me. And I just want to say that I'm really honored to be on your show. I want to thank you for having me and for allowing some time, space, and a place for this discussion.
Absolutely. Discussions like this are the show's bread and butter. Well, discussions like this, and then the next episode is going to be talking about an anime I had no business watching. But anywho, that is all for today's show. If you like this episode, don't forget to like and subscribe. My socials and Dr. Josh's website will be linked in the description, as well as who helped put the episode together. Follow us everywhere so you don't miss a beat, and tune in next Sunday at 6:30 p.m. for an all-new What's Going On with Dapper Don. You don't want to miss what I have in store. Peace out.